Across the Spiderverse is a lot. An overwhelming display of extreme sights and sounds, dynamic colors and stirring music, every single frame packed to the edge of the screen with details and movement, full to bursting with pure cinematic energy running from scene to scene and moment to moment with the frenetic speed of a bullet. Compared to its predecessor, Across the Spiderverse is simply more. More colors, more fast-paced action, more characters, more music, more everything. It is undeniably ambitious in its craft and a sheer technical achievement, if nothing else. It is a movie that is at its most impressive when it's moving at 100 miles per hour, faster than the human eye can reasonably track. But it's arguably more impressive when it shows its capacity to slow down. To take a moment to enjoy those colors, take in the music, absorb it all in stillness and appreciate it before it starts moving again faster than you can keep up with. And as it sprints along at 100 miles per hour, you can still see the beauty in the blur. That is Across the Spiderverse, a visually intense affair, overstimulating by design, virtually impossible to take in all at once. And yet it is the still moments that I keep coming back to. It is a film of enormous scope, yet it is also strangely intimate. The stakes are potentially universe-ending, but they are also intensely personal. It is a movie that feels so large and yet so small at the same time. It's so big because it's made up of so many smaller parts, each one just as important as the last. There's so much in Across the Spiderverse to look at, so much to think about, so much to take in and discover. And in that, depending on your focus, your preferences, your interests, there are so many different ways of viewing Across the Spiderverse, so many different interpretive levels and lenses by which to understand what this blur is trying to achieve and communicate. But for me, there are three that stand out the most. Three that cover the vastness of Across the Spiderverse and its complexity, each successive lens standing for a much broader level of the film and its thematics. And those three lenses are literal, allegorical, and metatextual. And of those three, I think the most important one, and the only one really worth exploring, is the first, the literal interpretation. Because once we start getting into more allegorical or metatextual readings, I think there's a danger of losing track of the story itself. A literal interpretation will keep us grounded and focused on the characters and their journeys as they are. So, without further ado, this is a literal interpretation of Across the Spiderverse. There is a surprisingly small amount of plot in this movie. For its nigh on 2.5-hour runtime, relatively little occurs. Miles fights Spot again, goes to the Spider Society, fights the Spider Society, goes to the wrong universe, to be continued, and that's pretty much it. But that's not a criticism, because in between all of those big things are a number of smaller moments. The movie's precious minutes are spent on characters, people, on Gwen's struggle with her father, on Miguel's frustration as he tries to keep everything together, on Miles's desire to belong somewhere. With everything else going on, the movie always, eventually, refocuses its efforts on those elements, on the people of this story and what they're going through, why all this matters to them. The first 20 minutes of the movie are focused entirely on Gwen and her loneliness, her experience of being Spider-Woman and her father believing she killed her best friend. It's the way she has to be closed off and adversarial because she's seen firsthand what happens when she lets people in. It's her tendency towards avoidance, trying to escape problems rather than solve them, clashing with her clear desire for connection and the very real pain that comes with being dishonest about who she really is. And I loved Gwen as a character in the first movie, but the first 20 minutes of this sequel make her an immensely more complex and interesting character for me than she had been otherwise. And that goes for just about every character in the movie, actually. Even relatively minor characters have more complexity than they did before, like Rio, Miles's mother. In the first movie, she was more or less just the stereotypical mother character. She's barely even featured, so what more can you do? But here, her role is somewhat expanded, and her character has one or two more layers. She's kind, but she's proud. She's hard, but she cares a lot. She's the only member of the family who doesn't just run out of places unexpectedly, and so she kinda takes on a leadership role for the household, with Miles' dad asking her permission to ground Miles only for her to temporarily unground him unilaterally. She's a character who wants to feel in control of the world around her, possibly because everything around her feels out of her control. But it's that desire for control that comes into conflict with a much more gentle and loving personality that just wants to do right by the people she cares about. She's not the deepest character anyone's ever written, she's not even the deepest character in this movie, but for a minor character in this large of a cast, the fact that so much personality shines through so clearly is a testament in itself to Across the Spider-Verse's dedication to its characters. And frankly, that's why Across the Spider-Verse lends itself so well to a more literal, straightforward interpretation, because the characters, the people, are so integral to the way this story moves and operates that it becomes difficult to understand the film in any way that distances us too far from those characters and their personal, literal journeys throughout. And this is most obviously seen in our protagonist, Miles Morales himself. Much like Gwen, he feels lonely, mostly because of Spider-Man. He can't tell anyone about who he really is, and that creates a wall between him and the people he knows, especially his parents, who feel very much like they're getting cut out of their son's life, and that's kind of because they are. But with Gwen's experience of telling her dad not going very well, Miles has very little reason to expect that his would be any better. So he remains alone, unable and unwilling to reveal himself to the people that he loves, while the people who already know him are universes away. At the end of the day, Miles just wants to belong somewhere. He wants to be a part of something. He wants to feel like who he is and what he does matters. It's why when Gwen tells him about the Spider Society, he immediately wants to join. It's a place full of people who actually know what he's going through because they've all been through it too. It is a place that will accept him fully and without caveat, or at least that's what Miles thinks, because Miguel O'Hara, the man in charge of the Spider Society, rejects him. Miguel is trying to keep everything under control, trying to preserve the multiverse itself, as the events of the first movie have thrown everything out of whack, and now constants of each universe, known as the canon, are in danger of being lost, which could have disastrous consequences. Miguel knows those consequences well. And Miles, in Miguel's mind, is the entire reason for this, because the spider that bit Miles wasn't from his universe. He wasn't supposed to be Spider-Man. Miguel calls him an anomaly, the original anomaly. In other words, a mistake, a problem. And on top of all of that, they want him to let his dad die to preserve the canon. It becomes clear that this place doesn't care about him, and so the only thing he can do is accept himself, literally reaffirm who he is in the face of Miguel's rejection, in the face of people telling him that he isn't what he's supposed to be. And that's what Across the Spider-Verse is all about, accepting yourself as yourself, refusing to let other people tell you you don't belong, and choosing to be who you want to be and what you want to do. And Miles is going to have to face the consequences of that spider biting him instead of a different Miles. And I'm sure that whenever Beyond the Spider-Verse comes out, it will give us something new to look at, but for now, this is the story. I definitely left some stuff out because it didn't really fit in this literal lens, but that's just the way of it. Maybe in some other universe I looked at it from one of the other ones I mentioned, but I don't really in Across the Spider-Verse to look at, so much to think about, so much to take in and discover. And in that, depending on your focus, your preferences, your interests, there are so many different ways of viewing Across the Spider-Verse, so many different interpretive levels and lenses by which to understand what this blur is trying to achieve and communicate. But for me, there are three that stand out the most. Three that cover the vastness of Across the Spider-Verse and its complexity, each successive lens standing for a much broader level of the film and its thematics. And those three lenses are literal, allegorical, and metatextual. And of those three, I think the most important one and the only one really worth exploring is the second one, allegorical. Because I think we risk getting a little too broad with a metatextual reading, losing sight of the actual story in the process, but a purely literal reading is a bit insufficient. We need to find a way to connect the literal narrative to our reality, or else there's not much of a point in analyzing the movie at all. An allegorical interpretation allows us that opportunity. So, without further ado, this is an allegorical interpretation of Across the Spider-Verse. Across the Spiderverse has a very teenage attitude about it, and I don't mean that in a bad way at all. I just mean it in the sense that Across the Spiderverse is very much a movie about being a teenager. A movie that can, in many ways, be taken as an allegory for the teenage experience itself. This is a movie where our two main characters are teenagers, and their primary conflicts are centralized around the struggles between them and adults, where the greatest desire is acceptance and the greatest fear is rejection. One of our protagonists, Gwen, doesn't want to tell her father that she's Spider-Woman because she's afraid of how that might make him see her, afraid that he would then reject her. And when circumstances push her to reveal the truth, he does reject her, tries to arrest her, chooses to put his duty within the system over his love for his daughter. And so, in the face of that rejection, she instead chooses to embrace the acceptance of a group she knows very little about. The teenage experience is one mostly of finding identity, slowly but surely starting to break away from your dependency on adult figures to tell you your values and instead figuring out what you believe on your own. And as your identity becomes more complex and more specific, the quest for where you belong and who understands you becomes ever more important. And so that desire for acceptance and the fear of rejection also becomes ever more powerful and influential. That's certainly the case for Miles, our other protagonist. Being Spider-Man is a huge part of who he is now. It's how he spends most of his time, seemingly. But that leaves him alone in the world, because in his world, he's the only Spider-Man, the only person alive who knows what it's like to be this. When Gwen and Miles are talking about this very thing, they do so while literally sitting upside down on top of a building, a perspective that literally could only be had by spider people.
I mean, how many people can you talk to about this stuff?
You don't even know.
And that's very much the feeling of a teenager, even if it's not necessarily true like it is with Miles. A teenager is just starting to form a genuine perspective on the world for the first time as they start gaining a more complex understanding of how the world works. But that perspective is incredibly limited at first, and so it can feel like you're all alone in it. There can be a sense, or perhaps simply a fear, that nobody understands you, that nobody will get it if you tell them what's going on, or worse, that they'll actively reject you if you tell them. That's Miles's fear with his parents, that they won't get it if he tells them, that they won't understand, that they'll be mad at him, punish him even, spurred on in that notion not only by Gwen's experiences with her dad, but also by his own parents' intensity.
Maybe he's scared to talk to you.
Why would anyone be scared to talk to me?
The Spider-Man identity can be a stand-in for really any type of secret a teenager may be hiding from their parents, whether it's something as small as liking something they see as embarrassing, or something as major as their sexuality or differing political beliefs. Anything where there may be some fear that it won't be understood or accepted for some reason, and that they will in turn be rejected by the people that are supposed to always be on their side. That fear dominates the first half of this movie. While the spot may give us plenty of superhero antics, most of the first hour is centered around a teenager being afraid that who he is and who he's becoming won't be accepted by the people important to him, while the adults in his life consistently try to instill control over him, control his story, themselves afraid that he's going to grow up and become part of something that won't care about him the same way they do.
And what I worry about most is they won't look out for you like us. They won't root for you like us.
His parents fear him being somewhere they can't protect him, doing things they can't help him with, or things they don't approve of. And in that, despite the assurances that he is loved, the message remains that they don't trust him enough to make the right choices. They don't respect him enough to believe that he'll do the right thing. They don't care enough to let him try. And so the fear lives. The fear of rejection. The fear that those assurances are merely lies. The fear that they only exist based on the assumption that he is what they expect him to be. The fear that what and who he is wrong. And in that fear, when you're given the option of remaining where you are and facing it, or going off to a place where people may actually understand you, what would you choose? And as we dive headfirst into the second half, the scope of the film becoming much broader, we also head into a much broader aspect of the teenage experience. Not just the fear of being rejected by your peers or your parents, but by the very systems that you live within. Because while a teenager first has to deal with how their burgeoning identity interacts with their immediate surroundings, it must eventually begin to confront the wider world they're going to occupy. And that wider world can have a greater influence than anything else. And to talk about this, we have to talk about the Spider Society, a group of spider people who deal with anomalies, things crossing dimensional lines accidentally due to the multiverse-shaking events of the first film. And I want to take a look at the two separate experiences of this group that our two protagonists have. We've already touched on Gwen's experience. In the midst of rejection by her father, this group was there to accept her, give her a sense of purpose, and most importantly, a way to run away from her problem. But for Miles, he is actively seeking out this group, but is turned away. Gwen even actively lies about what the group is to try and get him to lose interest in it, because she knows the truth and her avoidant personality won't allow her to tell him, because that would mean confronting the discomfort of that truth. And of course, the truth is that the Spider Society isn't the team of spider people saving others that Miles thinks it is. In fact, the primary duty of the Spider Society is to make sure that bad things happen, to make sure that the canon remains intact, that every spider person goes through all of the various deaths and tragedies that tend to befall them, including the death of Miles's father. Every Spider-Man loses a police captain that's close to them, and Miles's dad is just about to become captain. Miles is understandably upset by the idea that he has to stand by and let his father die, and so rejects the notion that this is the way things have to work. He rejects the system that is forcing him to go against what he believes is the right thing to do. But Gwen didn't. Gwen accepted that reality, even though it clearly makes her uneasy, even though it would also mean allowing her dad to die too because he's a police captain. But it's easier this way. This place accepted her, or at least acted like it did, while her father didn't. And it would get rid of the problem she has without her doing anything. In fact, it relies on her doing nothing. Gwen was accepted by the Spider Society first and then learned the truth of what it was, but Miles learned the truth first, and they never planned to accept him at all, because Miles was the original anomaly. The spider that bit him wasn't supposed to bite him, and even though it wasn't Miles's choice to be bitten, Miguel blames him for all of these problems he's trying to solve. Even among other spider people, Miles isn't understood, he isn't accepted, he doesn't belong. Who and what he is wrong. And as a teenager's identity forms, it is those interactions with the systems they live within, the supposed way the world works, and the people who maintain it that have some of the greatest impacts. Miles is consistently told by Miguel, the leader of this group and a de facto representative of this system, that he is just a kid, that he doesn't know what he's doing. Miguel treats him from the moment they meet like an inferior, a problem that causes other problems, and he treats Miles's resistance to the way things are as nothing more than the result of inexperience. He's naive, too young to really get why this is how things have to be. And whether he's right or not, the movie leaves it rather ambiguous, that only reveals to Miles that Miguel is nothing more than a stubborn and incurious man, unwilling to listen like every other adult in his life. Someone who just wants to force a story onto him rather than listen to the story he's lived. All of this while Gwen, accepted by these people, one of Miles's only real friends, sides with Miguel, even though she doesn't seem to think this is right either, because she was accepted by the system, a system that may very well benefit her, even if she's not completely comfortable with how it benefits her, because it's easier for her in a way that it isn't for Miles. But it's when she sees Miles reject that system, not because it rejected him, but because he doesn't believe it's right, that Gwen starts to question it herself, asking Miguel if he's sure that this is actually how it has to be. And that is when Miguel rejects her, sends her back to her dimension, leaving her with only one thing to say.
We are supposed to be the good guys.
The overall point of this allegorical interpretation of Across the Spider-Verse is that as teenagers form their identity, it is their interactions with both the people around them and the systems of our world that play the most vital roles. When a system accepts them for who they are, or at least claims to, they are much more willing to form their beliefs around maintaining that system, even if it contradicts other beliefs or feelings they may hold, especially if they aren't accepted elsewhere. But if they have an identity that is incompatible with the system that leads them to being treated as inferior or being rejected altogether, then it is much easier to see the flaws of that system and understand what it really cares about. Like I said before, the movie leaves things ambiguous for now, not ultimately solving the primary question about who is right. I'm sure we'll get into that in the sequel as Miles continues his quest to find where he belongs, as he ends this movie in a dimension he literally doesn't belong in, and as Gwen starts to try and make up for her complacency by beginning to resist the way Miles did. But for now, this is what we're left with. And I think so much in Across the Spider-Verse to look at, so much to think about, so much to take in and discover. And in that, depending on your focus, your preferences, your interests, there are so many different ways of viewing Across the Spider-Verse, so many different interpretive levels and lenses by which to understand what this blur is trying to achieve and communicate. But for me, there are three that stand out the most. Three that cover the vastness of Across the Spider-Verse and its complexity, each successive lens standing for a much broader level of the film and its thematics. And those three lenses are literal, allegorical, and metatextual. And of those three, I think the most important one, and the only one really worth exploring, is the third one, metatextual. Because a metatextual reading will allow us the broadest interpretation of Across the Spider-Verse's many elements, allow us to engage with the farthest reaching aspects of this movie and come to a more holistic understanding of its themes and ideas. It will allow us a big picture perspective, freed from minute details on the ground level, to understand what this movie is not only saying about our world, but about itself and stories in general. So, without further ado, this is a metatextual interpretation of Across the Spider-Verse. The meta elements of Across the Spider-Verse are rather clear, to the point where it's a little hard not to notice them. Though most of those metatextual elements don't really start showing up until the second half of the movie. The first half deals mostly with building character and individual relationships, which aren't of particular importance to this interpretation. Really, all that's worth talking about is the canon. The canon is just all of the things that every version of Spider-Man in every universe has to go through. They're tropes. That's what they are. They're tropes. They are the things that show up in every Spider-Man story in one way or another. Every Spider-Person is bitten by some kind of special spider. Every Spider-Person loses an uncle or the rough equivalent. Every Spider-Person eventually has to deal with a symbiote in some way. They are things that just always seem to show up in these stories. And Miguel O'Hara, the leader of the Spider Society, is obsessed with keeping things this way, making sure all these things continue to happen in all of these stories because he broke the canon once and it seemed to have an adverse effect. And because so much of the Spider-Man character is defined by death and tragedy, maintaining these tropes is often a matter of allowing bad things to happen, allowing innocent people to die, something that is very un-Spider-Man-like, and this whole situation itself asks a question about the very nature of the Spider-Man character. What is more important, the good that Spider-Man does or the pain that he endures? The good results that he achieves or the failures that have become iconic? The failures are the things we remember. We don't remember the random children that Spider-Man saves, but the girl whose neck broke falling off the Brooklyn Bridge. We don't remember the countless times that Spider-Man has saved his loved ones, but we all remember the few times that he didn't. Spider-Man can't have it all. That's been one of the key aspects of the character for decades. He saves one person, but another dies. He dedicates his life to saving everybody, but he loses any sense of happiness for himself. For every good thing, there is a bad of equal measure, and we always remember the bad far more than we do the good.
Being Spider-Man is a sacrifice. That's the job.
That's what you signed up for.
This is just the way it's always been done. The way these stories always go, and so it must remain. Spider-Man has to keep going through these things because if he doesn't, it's not true to the character. The person writing it doesn't understand them like the fans do, even though the fans seem divided on what actually defines Spider-Man as a character. But here's the interesting thing to me. The Spider Society began as a reaction to different people showing up in dimensions they weren't supposed to be in, potentially disrupting the canon if they remained where they didn't belong. And that was happening because of everything that happened with the Collider in the first movie. And according to Miguel, all of that happened because Miles was bit by a spider that was brought here from a different dimension and thus was not supposed to bite him. Miles is the original anomaly. But who says that this was an anomaly? Who's to say that wasn't what was supposed to happen? Who's to say that this wasn't just a different way of telling the story? I mean, if the canon has already been disrupted, then why is Miles's universe still intact? In this interpretation, Miles takes on the role of a disruptive creative force trying to change the way that the story is told, because he doesn't believe it should be told that way anymore. And isn't it then fitting that Miles would become Spider-Man because of a seeming disruption of the canon? It doesn't look like the way that it's always been done, but why does that mean it's wrong? Why does that mean it's an anomaly? Just because this creepy guy says so? Just because he had to experience a terrible tragedy and now thinks that everyone will suffer the same if the story ever changes? Across the Spider-Verse is a story about people trying to control the story. If you've ever tried to write a story, you know just how unwieldy it can get. How one change echoes across the landscape of the narrative in ways you never expected. How the more you try to make it work exactly the way you want it to, all it ever seems to do is push back. Not in malice, but simply because it is in the nature of the story to resist. And that's because of the characters. The people who are forced now to contend with what you've done and are going to react in whatever way they see fit regardless of your intentions. Because a story is just people, all with their own stories, all interacting and bouncing off each other, making a mess, a tangled web of pain and joy and loss and love that each and every one of us is trying and failing to control in our own ways. We like tropes because they're predictable, because it makes life feel more like a thoroughly planned sequence of destined actions rather than a blur of colors and sound, voices and actions, fast-paced and overstuffed and hard to keep up with in overwhelming display, moving at 100 miles per hour. And when you look at this story from up here, all you really see is the blur. You're too far up to see the individual people and their influence. A single story is made up of a million other stories, just as a singular system is made up of a million other individuals. The Spider Society as a group rejects Miles and supports the system as it is without question, but it's the individuals within it that make the biggest impact. Hobie, Margot, Peter B, it is their actions, their choices that are instrumental in helping Miles to escape even when against a much larger and stronger force. You have to take the people into account. You have to remember that they're there in the blur. The broader the conversation gets, the higher up you go, the more important it is to remember them. The more important it is to keep an eye on where the conversation began and who it is ultimately going to affect, because a story or a system isn't a very good one if it doesn't remember what it's really there for: the people. Tired, angry, afraid, and with no other options, Gwen goes back to her home. Her father is there as though all this time he's just been waiting for her. Gwen tries to run away again, avoid the problem like she always has, but her dad stops her, wanting to try and talk, only for Gwen to prove that she's not going to listen to him any more than he ever listened to her. He goes to leave, but Gwen does the unthinkable and goes after him, and she talks. She tells him all that matters, that she's trying as hard as she can to do the right thing, to make the right choices with the responsibility these powers have given her, but she's failing at every turn as the colors around her begin to bleed. And as her father tells her that he quit being a cop, the backgrounds become nigh on complete abstraction. He tells her the most important thing he could ever tell her.
You're the best thing I've ever done.
She pulls him into a hug as the world around them turns to this strange sort of mess. Only the outlines of things remain. Parts of the picture are erased completely. Blue is blending with pink and white in strange patterns, and yet it feels soft, almost comforting as these two stand solid and unmistakable. The rest of the world is there, sure, but it's only barely perceivable, because in this moment, the center of the universe lies at the center of this frame. The metatextual reading is obvious. Because her father quit being a cop, he isn't a captain, and therefore the canon has been disrupted. The story was not supposed to go this way, and yet here they stand. The story can change for the better. Sure, it's not the tragedy we expect from a Spider-Man story, but it's just as honest, just as real. In the allegorical reading, it's a teenager finally opening up about who they really are and what they're struggling with, finding the courage to confront the possibility of rejection. Because as Gwen learned, it's better to be honest with yourself and about what you believe than to let the fear of rejection and the desire for acceptance change you. And in the literal reading, well, it's right there. I don't need to tell you. You can see it, feel it, and that's the most important thing, I think. Allowing yourself to be at the ground level where the people are simply being. Not that the rest of it doesn't matter. If I thought that, I wouldn't be making this video, but I do think you need to start here, enveloped in the moment with the people. You need to know them first so that you can remember them later. Across the Spider-Verse works because it remembers them. It works not because of all the colors and the music and all of its technical marvels. It works because all of those things only matter as much as the people. This blur of a movie is about the people that make it up. It can be seen from so many different vantage points, viewed from so many different perspectives. The ones I've outlined here are but a few. But I think the true success of Across the Spider-Verse is that it never loses sight of the things that matter the most. Through every level, as it gets broader and more complex, as the scope gets bigger and bigger, the individual people only matter more and more. A single story is made up of a million smaller stories, and Across the Spider-Verse never forgets that. There's so much in Across the Spider-Verse to look at, so much to think about, so much to take in and discover. And in that, depending on your focus, your preferences, your interests, there are so many different ways of viewing Across the Spider-Verse, so many different interpretive levels and lenses by which to understand what this blur is trying to achieve and communicate. But for me, there are three that stand out the most. Three that cover the vastness of Across the Spider-Verse and its complexity, each successive lens standing for a much broader level of the film and its thematics. And those three lenses are literal, allegorical, and metatextual, and they all matter. They're all important ways of looking at the movie. They're all just a fraction of what makes it up, and you can't talk about one without at least acknowledging the others. That's what this movie is about, I think. Just look at its villain. The Spot just wants people to care. That's all. He's a villain made up of holes, and the world around him tells him that those holes are all that matter about him. In fact, when he has no holes, he begins to resemble a wireframe body, an unfinished, unidentifiable drawing of a person. He can't get a job, he can't make friends, he can't be a member of society whatsoever. He has simply fallen into the role of being a supervillain because that's the only identity he can have where people will care. And if the only thing that makes him special is his holes, then he comes to the only conclusion that makes any kind of sense. He needs to become just one big hole, defined by all the bad he's gone through, all the tragedy he's endured, the emptiness that he feels. The movie itself labels him as a villain of the week, a joke, just something Spider-Man has to deal with, another part of the blur. But for the Spots, he's not just a villain of the week. He's not a joke. This is his life. This matters to him more than anything in the world, whether the rest of the world cares or not. In a world that's already far bigger than us, in a universe bigger than we can truly comprehend, in a multiverse that expands that size out into seemingly infinity, how can we truly matter? Every character in this movie has their own perspectives, their own ways of viewing the world, their own struggles within that world, and all anyone really wants is for someone to listen to them, to hear them, to care. But one of the main flaws those same characters have to overcome is their unwillingness to listen. Their unwillingness to believe that anyone else's problems could be as important as their own. Because the moment we start to think of it that way is the moment that it becomes possible that everyone's problems are more important than ours. That what we go through doesn't matter. Our story doesn't matter. Our victories and our tragedies aren't important in this blur of colors and sounds. But that blur is made up of so many tiny pieces, so many stories that each push it along in their own ways. Without one single spider, the entire world could change. It's important to see the blur as a whole, to try and understand it in all of its many facets, but it's just as important to remember that you're still there. Maybe from up here you are imperceptible, but you are still there. I don't know what's going to happen in Beyond the Spider-Verse. Frankly, I'm content to wait rather than speculate, but I know that it won't forget the people. It won't forget Miles or Gwen or Miguel O'Hara or the Spot, because it knows it has to remember them. So that when the film is pulling you through everything at 100 miles per hour, you can still see the beauty